Imagine going to prison for something you didn't do. That's what happened to Michael Hansen.
Yeah, he was convicted of killing his infant daughter, but new evidence showed he was innocent. And tonight, in his first one-on-one interview, Hansen speaks candidly about his newfound freedom and how the system failed him. Fox 9 investigator Jeff Ballion joining us tonight. Jeff, this is quite a story.
Yeah, what happened to Michael Hansen is disturbing. His story speaks to the power of a medical examiner in a murder case. And it raises the question, who keeps medical examiners accountable?
I'm frustrated because I feel like I'm not normal. I feel like I'm not normal.
After 6 agonizing years in prison for a crime that wasn't a crime,
I feel different. I feel like, kind of like, where do I belong? Kind of.
Michael Hansen is struggling with the emotional trauma of it all.
It's hard. But, I mean, I know where I belong, but it's kind of like more like, who am I? You know?
No longer labeled a convicted murderer.
Okay, come on.
He's restarting his life, grateful to see his kids again.
It's a real big thing for me. It's a real respected tattoo artist, so it's a real big thing for me to be able to come in here and work next to him.
Hansen's an aspiring artist. Here's a sample of his work. He's currently in training and hopes to one day run his own tattoo business.
What happened to me could happen to anybody, and I don't want to see that happen to anybody.
He'd always maintained his innocence, never once considered taking a plea bargain that would have drastically cut his time behind bars.
Yeah, this was a terrible injustice.
For the first time, you will hear from some of the experts who helped set him free, including a surprising one. She was hired by the prosecution.
I really felt that there was a real good possibility that little Ariana, was her name, died accidentally.
The system failed Hansen in many ways, but it started with an autopsy by Dr. Michael McGee, Chief Medical Examiner for Ramsey County.
If Dr. McGee was sitting where I am right now, what would you say to him?
I'd tell him to quit his job.
Hansen's 3-month-old daughter, Avery, died suddenly while in his care. The case was turned over to Dr. McGee to investigate. He found she had a large skull fracture. He ruled the death a homicide.
If I never hurt my daughter, I would never hurt any of my children ever.
If it had been your case originally, would you have ruled this a homicide?
No, this wouldn't be ruled a homicide. I mean, it certainly might be ruled undetermined.
Undetermined because there was a reasonable explanation for the skull fracture and no physical evidence the fracture had caused a deadly brain injury. A week before Avery's mysterious death, her mother had taken her to Walmart. This is video from a store camera of the two of them. Avery was strapped in a car seat, which was placed on top of a shopping cart. The cart hit a bump and the seat went flying. Avery landed face down, still in the car seat. She cried a lot, but appeared uninjured.
You know, he knew about the accident that had happened at Walmart. He knew about that. But it seemed to me and to everyone else that he ruled this a homicide without even doing any research into that.
Dr. McGee testified that common sense told him that Avery's massive skull fracture could not have happened from the shopping cart fall. If it had, he said, she would have lost consciousness almost immediately and died in a matter of hours. The jury found Michael Hansen guilty of second-degree murder.
It was numbing. I couldn't believe it.
Lawyers for the Innocence Project couldn't believe it either.
That fall was obviously very inconsistent with their theory of prosecuting Michael.
They set out to prove Hansen's conviction was a travesty of justice.
Now, were you paid for your review of this case?
No.
So you did it free of charge?
Right.
6 experts volunteered to review the evidence. They all concluded Avery's death was a tragic accident, not a homicide.
I'm just really glad that I wasn't the person that called this a homicide. I would feel really badly about someone being in prison for 6 years because I made a mistake.
Dr. Thomas and 3 other forensic pathologists determined Avery's skull fracture was an older injury in the process of healing consistent with the shopping cart fall. They could find no evidence she suffered a brain injury that would have killed her. At the trial, Dr. McGee acknowledged he couldn't see a brain injury, but said it had to be there because Avery died.
He came up with something in his head and stuck with it.
McGee never did anything to recreate the dynamics of the shopping cart fall. A biomechanical engineer hired by the Innocence Project did and showed that kind of fall could fracture a child's skull. McGee never asked doctors who treat children with head injuries if a child can have a serious fracture and still be healthy. They can.
And the skull does fracture, and those babies usually do very well.
Dr. Carolyn Levitt, a renowned expert on child abuse, was hired by the prosecution to review the new evidence collected by the Innocence Project. Instead of tearing it apart, she agreed with it.
I think definitely the system failed.
Levitt says a case like this is why a team of experts, not just one medical examiner, should review the facts before criminal charges are filed.
I think that there was lack of all the opinions that were needed in this child.
If a brain injury didn't cause Avery's death, what did?
Most likely the death was related to positional asphyxia or unsafe sleep environment.
Avery was found dead in bed. She'd been sleeping face down on a soft, squishy surface surrounded by pillows and blankets. Her father and sister were also sleeping there, all risk factors for an infant to suffocate.
But Dr. McGee had never gone to the scene to see what role the sleep environment played in Avery's death.
Other medical examiners tell us that should be standard procedure anytime an infant dies mysteriously in bed. After hearing the new evidence, the trial judge concluded Dr. McGee had given false or incorrect testimony. Michael Hansen was set free.
Is anything going to happen? You know? And I can't even get an apology?
Dr. McGee remains defiant. He won't do an interview, but in an email to the Fox 9 investigators says he still believes the Hansen case was a homicide and should be retried.
He should have to answer to people, and he doesn't have to answer to anybody.
The fallout of the Hansen case did prompt Ramsey County, one of 15 counties McGee contracts with, to conduct an administrative review of his performance. They checked to make sure his license and certification are current, then declared him fit for duty. But documents obtained by the Fox 9 investigators show the county didn't review specific cases, didn't have independent experts see if his findings are based on sound science.
County officials refused to do an interview with us. We did get an email.
Ramsey County continues to review all the information in this matter and has not made a decision with regard to any future actions. Over the past year, the Fox 9 investigators have reported on several murder convictions where Dr. McGee is accused of getting it wrong.
I couldn't find her. All I could find was waves.
Thomas Rhodes is serving a life sentence for the murder of his wife. The case centered on testimony from Dr. McGee, who said an autopsy revealed Rhodes beat up his wife and threw her off a boat.
Nothing like that happened.
After Rhodes was convicted, 3 other experts reviewed McGee's autopsy records. They found no signs of an assault. They called the death an accidental drowning. Our coverage of the Rhodes and Hansen cases were both mentioned in a petition filed recently by a lawyer for Alfonso Rodriguez, now on death row, for the murder of college student Drew Shadeen. The motion seeks to overturn the death sentence, claiming Dr. McGee used junk science and lied when he testified that Shadeen had been raped and stabbed. Quoting the petition, McGee has often performed shoddy work and drawn questionable conclusions for the benefit of the prosecution.
Anybody else would be held accountable.
Who does keep medical examiners accountable? There is no official oversight of their work. Ramsey County believes that's the responsibility of the courts.
So frustrating, but now he's a free man. Here we are 6 months later, or 6 years later. What was life in prison like for him? And has he been able to get his life back to normal?
Well, he said going in, he always maintained his innocence. And he said, I'm here. I'm going to try to be positive. He said he couldn't believe every year would pass and something didn't happen, that he'd get out. But he took advantage of the situation, took classes, got his license to cut hair, become a barber. So he tried to make the most of it. But now he's struggling with processing it all. It's really hard to think back what happened to him.
Yeah,
and he hasn't received an apology.
Yeah, this is like a PTSD, of course, that he's going to have to deal with for quite some time. Does he have any recourse as time goes on here? I mean, will he be able to do something
For
to
the time
get
he was
something
lost?
from the medical examiner, whether it's an apology or otherwise?
That's a big question. We don't know.
Well,
All right.
I'm sure the story will continue as this continues. Thanks, Jeff.